to tonight's How To Academy event. I can see we still have people joining us, but I'll go ahead and get started. Today we are joined by two-time world champion debater, Bo Seo. Bo is a former coach of the Australian national debating team and the Harvard College Debating Union. One of the most recognized figures in the global debate community, he has won both the World Schools Debating Championship and the World Universities Debating Championship. Bo has written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, CNN, and many other publications. His new book, and the basis for today's talk, is The Art of Disagreeing Well. This evening, he will share an unforgettable toolkit in the skills of debating. There will be time for your questions at the end and possibly throughout, so feel free to write your questions or answers in the Q&A box on your screen. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Bo.
Thanks very much, Dana, and thanks very much, everyone, for having me. I'll start today by just noting what a particular pleasure it is to be addressing the How To Academy. For a really long time, the working title that I had for this book, which came out as Good Arguments in the US and The Art of Disagreeing Well in the UK. They're not two separate books. The working title I had for it was How to Disagree Well. And I thought it was a selling title. I was wrong about that. But I wanted, and I think the final product still has in its DNA, that desire to be useful, to give people morsels of information and steps they can take to be additive in their disagreements, whether it be at home or in the workplace or out in the public square. But more substantively, that title points to two things that animate this project that I think I sort of share with the How To Academy. The first is that arguing is a skill. That we're used to thinking about disagreements as just a fact of life, as a description of the way things are. If you feel one way, I feel some other way, we're in a state of disagreement. We sometimes think about disagreement as like a natural disaster that just visits upon us. Now we're in a disagreement, now what do we do? Whereas I think one of the things that has allowed our public conversations to get as divisive and painful as they are today is that we've forgotten that disagreeing is also a skill. It's a craft, it's work, it's a kind of an art, and perhaps restoring the quality of our conversations requires us to step back into that. And so to be in a forum that talks about the how-to of it, I think has done a part of my job for me, which is convincing you that this is something you can get better at. The second part of it is, and a part of what animates this project is just a belief of where I think the site of action can be when it comes to improving the state of our conversations, which is responsible in large part for the health of our organizations and even the health of our society. And my view is that it starts with people like us, right? It is true that a lot of debaters end up in very powerful positions in government and business and so on. But I think it's also true at this moment that the cultural elite, the political elite, and the kind of example they set for how we hash out our disagreements in public have proven lacking in a lot of ways. And, you know, sometimes people ask me whether debating is a kind of an elite activity. And I think I might have a dimmer view of the elite than that. And part of my hope is when we as individual citizens, as members of families, members of workplaces, start to relearn some of these skills, that we can, through one conversation at a time, start making things better. So with that in mind, I'll try and do three things just to get the ball rolling today. I'll go on for about maybe 40 minutes, and then we'll have a dedicated Q&A at the end. But I've now been on the tour with this book for about 2 months, which is sort of a purgatory experience. And so rather than kind of talking at you, I'll invite some engagement throughout the presentation. So the way to do that is through the Q&A box or the chat box. I think I can see both. So please feel free to start dropping in questions now if as they occur to you, if you think you'll forget. But in times where some engagement would help, I ask for your patience and cooperation. So I'll try and do three things. The first is I'll tell you the story of how it is that I came to write this book, and I'll weave in throughout 4 lessons that give you a flavor of the kind of teaching I want to do with the book, and can hopefully be useful takeaways unto themselves that that you can go away from this presentation knowing and feeling a bit more confident about using. Then I'll tell you a bit more about what's in the book, and then I'll offer 2 questions that I think I'm still not terribly sure about on this subject matter, and that I would ask for your input and your thinking. And I think those are 2 questions that might be of particular relevance to this audience. So how did I come to write this book? I moved when I was 8 years old from South Korea to Australia with my parents, and I didn't speak English at the time. And I quickly learned that, and some of you might have had that experience of moving across borders or even different linguistic communities. I learned that the hardest part of doing that is adjusting to real life conversation, which are nothing like what you see in the textbooks of the rabbit asking the bird what time it is or something like that. And I also learned that the hardest conversations to adjust to were arguments, because that was when passions tended to run and people's facial expressions stopped matching what was coming out of their mouths. The rhythms of ordinary speech began to break down, and people started to interrupt. And I sensed then, even as a kid, what a lot of newcomers to a place, I think, feel, which is that their belonging to that new place is conditional. It extends only insofar as you don't rock the boat too much, or you don't challenge the way things are, that you put in a good faith effort to assimilate and fit yourself around the surroundings. And I felt that voicing any differences that I had with my peers would mark me out as an outsider and would unsettle what foothold of belonging I'd been able to achieve. And though I experienced that in a very particular way through the experience of migration, I think this is an experience we all have when we go to a new place, a new workplace, a new neighborhood, even a gathering where we don't know very many people. And the same thing that happens to us in those situations happened to me, which is I resolved to be very agreeable. I learned to smile and nod my head and keep most of my thoughts to myself. And I thought that would be the kind of the groove in which I would ride out most of my life. And the thing that broke me out of that that posture of conflict aversion was something that my year 5 teacher, my elementary school teacher, told me, which was on the debating team, in debating, when one person speaks, no one else does. And to someone who had been spoken over and interrupted and spun out of conversation, that sounded like a kind of salvation. So the first thing that I learned about debating that brought me into the activity was that every disagreement should start with some agreement. And that's agreement about how we're going to have the conversation, that we're going to give each party an equal amount of time to speak, that we're not going to interrupt, and instead we're going to take turns, right? So I get a go, you get a go, but I'm going to get a chance to respond, so I don't have to interrupt you right away. And that amount of agreement created a kind of an acoustics that gave me the confidence that I might be heard. So the first lesson that I wanted to share with you today, and I'm going to try and share a screen here, and this I'm going to ask for some participation here, is that every disagreement should start with some agreement. That's agreement about the rules of how we're going to have the conversation, but it's also crucially agreement about what it is that we're going to disagree about, right? What it is that the conversation is about. So I'll try and illustrate this point here. And if you're having issues seeing it, please just bring it to my attention through a flurry of texts or something else. So the first lesson I wanted to share today is that when we go into a disagreement, we should start by naming the disagreement. And I'll give you an illustration of how this works in debating, how I think it might apply to everyday life, and how it helped me when I was that kid who was just starting out on the debating team. So think about a disagreement like this, which a lot of my friends who are young parents often have, which is whether we should send the kids to the local public school. And by public school in this instance, I mean government school. I know it has it might be inverted in the UK, but government school. So on the face of it, this seems like a fairly simple dispute. And if I had to highlight the one word that the disagreement pivots around, it's this idea of send. Should we send them or not? Right? But I want you just to have a look at this sentence. Think about the two sides and the people who might disagree. And if you can, just take a minute and put in the chat or put in the Q&A box, what do you think this argument might really be about? What it might come down to? And to give you a clue, it's often the case that one argument contains many arguments, that one disagreement contains many disagreements within it. So if you can, please throw in some suggestions, and I'll give you a minute, and then I'll start reading out a few of the suggestions. Okay, so some really terrific suggestions here, and I'll share a few. So Christine says it might be about income differences, right? And I'm not sure whether it's the income differences with the other children at the school or at the school they might be going to if it wasn't the local government school. But whatever it is, that's not necessarily obvious from the text of the disagreement, right? It's something kind of simmering underneath. Sharon says politics and or money. Similarly, it's sort of that's less simmering underneath, then it almost sets the context for the disagreement. Anonymous says how to best educate our kids. So that's really a point about the children, and not even really about the schools and the standard of education. And Ale maybe, says it could be something very specific, like are the teachers well prepared? And there are suggestions about cultural ambitions, resentment, and says elitism. These are important kind of political, communal concepts that form the background too. So notice how when you look through these suggestions, we're starting to broaden out well beyond what seems like a really simple disagreement about the choice to send or not. And I'll give you my take on it, and all of those suggestions, if they're not covered by my read, they also exist in addition. So another place to put the pivot point in this disagreement may not be send, but it might be about kids. And this is quite similar to what Ale suggested. So we might disagree about what our kids are like, right? Are they shy? Are they introverted? Are they, kids who would really thrive with a lot of extracurriculars? Are they very academic? We might have disagreements in our judgments of what our children are like. We might also disagree about what our children need, right? Is the thing that they most need a lot of attention from their teachers? Is it exposure to a wide diversity within the student body? It could be different things. And you can go through this exercise for almost all of the words in this sentence. So we might have a disagreement around the word we, right? What are our obligations as parents? Is our obligation primarily to our kids? Do we also have to think about the health of the local government school system, for example? And as many of you have pointed out in the thread, we might disagree about the local government school. We might disagree about the kind of education they would get there. There may be just straightforward factual disagreements. So I might think they do have a music program. You might think they don't. And those disagreements could form the background. They could, in fact, be the kind of the beating heart of what seemed on surface just a debate about whether we send kids to the school or not. So one of the things that we learn to do in debating is not only to name our disagreements, but then to name the disagreements within the disagreements. And once you've done that, I think you can do two things. The first is you avoid misunderstanding of confecting a disagreement where there isn't one. You can get to the heart of what the disagreement is really about. And it may well be that if you can resolve the factual disagreement about whether the school has a music program or not, if you can resolve the normative disagreement about whether you have an obligation to contribute to the local government school system or not, then the most visible disagreement about whether we send the kids there or not kind of disappears. It gets resolved because that wasn't the heart of the matter. It was a flow-on disagreement that comes from a more fundamental dispute, right?